Hey everyone, you're listening to the d.MBA podcast where we share business confidence for designers. My name is Alan and I am a business designer and founder of the d.MBA program. And you're welcome to another business design jam where we take business news or business concepts that are relevant to the work of designers and we try to dissect them and see how we can use it as designers. So today I'm joined by two d.MBA alumni, Tom and James, so Tom Prior and James Bickerton, who are both design freelancers and actually both also from the UK, which accidentally happened to be two people who I wanted to talk to about this topic. And today we'll talk about positioning and pricing for design freelancers. So how do we price our services, set the terms for payments, choose clients, position ourselves, and so on. So we'll be covering a business topic relevant for designers. And if you would like to learn more about business topics relevant for designers, you're well welcome to join our 7-day mini MBA, which is an email course where over 7 days you receive 7 emails. And in each of these emails, you learn a business concept relevant for designers. So to subscribe, head over to d.MBA/mini-MBA. So now let's dive into the episode. James and Tom, can you tell us what do you do and how do you think about your positioning? Because positioning is one of those very important things that kind of affects our pricing. So I just figured we would start with the positioning to learn about both of you. So maybe James, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alan. Hi, Tom. So yeah, I am a experienced designer is how I position myself. And I've been working freelance on and off probably for the last 20 years. And I've started again working as a freelance designer since, I would say, November of last year in 2021. And before that, I was positioned as a product design lead. That was my positioning as a product design lead. And that immediately gives you permission, should we say, to charge a little bit more. Because you're seen as a lead, you're seen as someone who's going to be having client contact, who's going to probably be leading a team. And that's why I position myself as a lead. I've recently transitioned from product design into service design. That's why I kind of call myself an experienced designer. Also do a little bit of business design as well, from working with yourself in the course. And I've recently just finished a stint working on the Ivy restaurant, working through their service design problems, which was a great experience. And that again was working as a service design lead, leading a team of 3. And that's, I think, yeah.
So for those projects, you're working with are you working with consultancies?
Yes, largely with consultancies. Sometimes I'm brought in directly by the client, but I generally work through consultancies. Yeah.
Got it. What about you, Tom?
Yeah, so again, thanks Alan for having us on. James, great to meet you. And I've been positioning myself as I would say I've avoided the term freelance, I have to say, as a sort of experienced design and strategy consultant for the last 5 years. So the 10 years previous to that, I was agency side, ended up being sort of director level at the agency I was at, and was very much positioned myself as a sort of senior strategist. But I didn't really have to do the job of positioning myself so much. It was more about the agency I worked for. I had my own sort of profile, but it was very much kind of aimed at, I would say, at my peers almost, as far as trying to attract talent into the agency, talking a lot about the kind of skills and tools I would use to try and find sort of alignment with people I wanted to bring into the team, and they would recognize we're doing things that they recognize. But I think from a positioning perspective, when I first went freelance contract 5 years ago, I still had that kind of mindset. I was very much positioning myself based on, I guess you would call them the features of a designer, the tools I could use, the processes I went through. And I've kind of moved that positioning more towards the outcomes that I offer. So the language that I use now is very much, and I think a lot of this is inspired by what I learned on dMBA, around the outcomes that I can help someone get to through design. And actually, there's not an awful lot on my sort of business website around, I do prototyping or design sprints and stuff like that. You can dig in and find that. But I'm really trying to position myself as someone who is a sort of design strategist, mainly working with scale-ups and enterprise teams who want to use design to get to some measurable outcomes. And that is something I'm kind of reworking and refining all the time. But it's definitely a positioning shift. A lot of it kind of encouraged by getting more confident in talking about myself in those terms. And I've no doubt that position will change again at some point.
Yeah, it's a living thing, right? You're evolving and changing and adjusting also to what's happening on the market. I would like to hear your perspective on like what entails positioning. You both now talked about like how you introduce yourself. Are you a contractor or a freelancer or a lead, or like what is the outcome? Is it just the title that's the positioning, or is there anything else you try to do to position yourself the way you want to position yourself?
So I guess from Tom, there's something really important Tom mentioned there in terms of calling yourself a consultant. That's something that's, I think, really important. And it's something that I was classed as in my last permanent job, a consultant, and that we were a consultancy rather than a freelancer or contractor. Because I tend not to use that freelancer word as well, because it has a lot of associations around it. And the associations are generally picking up a designer from Fiverr or having someone come in as not always Fiverr, but I'd say more of a craftsperson who is probably somewhere in the middle of their career, maybe a little bit earlier, and is definitely doesn't align with a strategist, I would say, or someone a little bit more senior.
I think it's a really strong point to make when it comes to positioning, is like the language you're using. And I think using the language of contractor over freelancer is an important first one. I think freelancer is a sort of loaded one as far as the way you might operate, maybe the scale of projects you take on. I think there's a place for people who call themselves freelancers for sure, and I think James has alluded to that, but I think you kind of are positioning yourself in a different way by saying you're a contractor. So I think from a language perspective, I think you're probably more likely to be less measured on maybe time and deliverables and more on the value you bring in decision making. That's how I tend to see it. So yeah, it's a term I use. But to your question about, to kind of follow up on that around what is positioning, for me it's setting a context of kind of where you see yourself belonging, and clients having some, like, recognizing the context in which you're positioning yourself. So for example, if I am using the language a lot of just a skill set, a list of skills, I think I'm comparing myself with, like you say, people on Fiverr or people of all different levels in the sort of seniority chart when it comes to design. Mm-hmm. And it becomes quite difficult to kind of distinguish who's going to bring additional value. How senior are you? Do you specialize in certain areas? So I think from a positioning perspective, I think language and context is super important. That context can very often be around the industries that you work in, the value that you've delivered in a particular industry, for example, and talking some of that language maybe. It kind of moves a little bit into something I think we're going to discuss around the focus versus, are you a generalist or a specialist in a certain area? And I think something that I'm becoming more interested in from a positioning perspective is positioning myself in particular industries. and really starting to speak the language of a particular industry that either I enjoy working in or want more work in. So starting to allude to challenges they might have and position myself as someone who kind of can relate to that and bring value in that very specific area. I've definitely made, not necessarily a mistake in the past, but I've definitely suffered from pitching myself a lot as a generalist for the fear of missing out on projects. And I'm starting to now realise, actually, I want to bring that in a little bit. So for me, like I say, using language that sets a context that my clients recognise in their industry is one area.
It's almost like a never-ending topic or challenge of, should I be a generalist or should I specialize? It's also like the same thing when you're thinking about entrepreneurship, like, oh, I don't want to just do this one thing. I want to do more things. And maybe it's also about the time perspective, like when you're starting out with being a contractor or a freelancer, and when you're starting out in your career, maybe it does make sense to be more of a generalist and then going more into, focusing on something. But I would be curious to hear, Tom, your story. So what made you now think that you want to focus on certain industries? And what are the first results you're seeing by focusing just on certain type of companies?
So the things I've noticed, first of all, is the leads that are coming in are a bit more focused. I had a very scattergun kind of inbound leads as a contractor. It was junior things with kind of lower day rates, or it was even permanent roles, because I wasn't making it clear that I was for hire. These are the ways to engage with me. It was very much could be the portfolio for someone who's an intern or an internal person who just wants a profile out there rather than a business. So it's been a very different. I say, still get those things occasionally, but I'd say the big thing is that I get fewer leads, but they tend to be more relevant. Tend to be those scale-ups and enterprise teams that I'm kind of targeting a bit more. I would say I feel far more confident in those conversations as well. So I feel like I, on a personal level, have tried to make my messaging a bit clearer around where I fit. And it means that when I'm kind of pitching myself or having that conversation with clients, it's not so scattergun. They're not expecting me to do a whole raft of things. And I can quite confidently say, you might want someone else for these things. But I'm not having to have those conversations so much because I do feel like my messaging is a bit clearer. So I'd say that the quality of leads and type have been more accurate.
How did you communicate that you work with these industries? Is this on your LinkedIn, your website, or is it just because of word of mouth?
So it's definitely something I need to refine more, but I've got stuff on my website at the moment that kind of talks about, I specifically don't talk about startups. So I talk about the fact that there's an area on my website around kind of services, and it's like scale ups and enterprise. I kind of start off by talking about that and kind of outcome businesses that are very aware of being outcome focused, and they don't just want deliverables from design. Kind of that has become a kind of clear part of my proposition, but also being a designer who is business savvy. So I think that is a big part of my messaging. If you look at some of the stuff around my approach, I really push the fact I've done the d.MBA. And also I have a side project called Designs in Business, which kind of started out, it was a dual thing for me. It was like, I'm genuinely interested in learning more about business, but actually from a positioning perspective, having this small kind of side projects around that has really helped people come to me knowing that I've got some of that acumen and I'm really interested in being involved in business decision making. And obviously after the d.MBA, I felt even more confident to kind of push that a little bit more as well. So I think that kind of business angle and wanting to be involved in business decision making is a bit that I'm still working on, but it's definitely starting to become more part of what I talk about.
Yeah, that's definitely something that everybody should check out. Designers in Business. Tom is running like a really interesting newsletter covering business concepts for the design community. How is that for you, James? The jack of all trades versus specialization question.
Yeah, I definitely have suffered from that as well. And to mirror really what Tom said, it's something I think you quite naturally do early on in your career. You have that fear of missing out on projects. You kind of take on everything that you possibly can and start experimenting really in finding where your strengths are and finding exactly what interests you. Which industries interest you? Is it fintech? Is it music? Is it something entirely different? And through that process, you start to specialize. I don't know of anyone actually who's specialized right from the offset and said, right, I just want to do fintech and that's all I want to do, right from going from the first year in their career to doing their 10th year in their career. I often find as well that every couple of years I want to pick up a new skill set or peek into a different industry as well. But I definitely say that my focus over the last 4, 5, maybe 6 years even has been fintech, and that's just quite naturally happened where a friend was in HSBC and he said they need another contractor here. And I said, okay, and came in for an interview. It looked like a good opportunity to completely redesign HSBC's banking app. And I then carried on in that vein because I actually quite enjoyed understanding how money works. I had a terrible knowledge of it, understanding exactly how the finance industry worked. And it was actually a big reveal working in the industry, how much things can be improved, should we say. And when you start focusing in on one industry, you can start to have a lot better conversations, quality conversations with business people. And you start seeing the same patterns of problems and such. And you've almost got the answer to their problem. You can almost give them the outcome just within a few minutes of talking and understanding what they need or what their problem is. So I highly recommend it. But then saying that, I've now gone off on this tangent into luxury dining with the Ivy. And that just came out because I took some time off from leaving my last permanent position, going back to freelancing last November. And I haven't really been looking for anything. I was okay not to actually work for a few months. And it was a service design company that I worked with before. They knew that I could do product design and UX and UI and all that, but they specifically came to me and said, we want you to lead this small team. We want you to do strategy because we actually don't think, James, that your strength or the thing that we want to employ you for is UX, UI and product design. We actually want you to lead the strategy part and do that piece. And that was interesting to hear from the other side, rather than you selling your skill sets or knowledge. From the other side to come to you and say, look, we've been observing you. We know what you've been doing over the last few years. We think actually this is your strength. And I said yes, because it was a really, really great opportunity. And it actually worked out really well. It was actually nice not to have to worry about how something is going to look, the final product, the final app. It was more interesting actually working in the strategy side of thing. Okay, what is the outcome? What do you want the service or customer experience of the Ivy restaurant to be in the future? You want your customers to order 3 more drinks, or should we say, I shouldn't say too much, but you want to increase their spend by X, for example. And doing the research and working out exactly what those outcomes are and focusing on that gave a lot of value back to my clients and to the team that I work with. And being focused and not trying to do everything, maybe having an opinion on how something looked from a craft perspective, but actually not sharing it, just focusing on the strategy piece, gave a lot more value to the client and the team as well.
I should pick up on a really interesting point I think that James made there around you'd been doing fintech work for a while, and I don't know whether you're positioning yourself in that area, but I guess your LinkedIn might have looked like you've been doing that for a bit. And then you get picked up by someone like the Ivy, which feels like a completely different world, like super interesting, and I imagine quite refreshing after working in finance for a while. I think that's a really important lesson for people who worry that we talked about this fear of missing out, right? If I don't show that I can do everything, I might miss something interesting like that, and that sounds like a great project. There's this like bias of the halo bias that I think we can take advantage of, and that's a good example where if you're strong at a particular area of your craft, say as a designer you're very good at strategy in fintech or designing fintech, people aren't going to assume that you're rubbish at everything else. They can think, well, actually that halo effect of being good at one thing, people tend to assume that you can transfer those skills. We see it in all kinds of worlds. So I think it's a really important kind of great lesson example of like, you might position yourself in one area, but people are still probably going to reach out to you for other types of work. Obviously, that's kind of happened with James. So don't be afraid to tighten it up. But to your point, James, about starting off with a broad positioning, I think that's generally good advice. You don't know what position you're going to want to end up in unless you go broad to start with. There's a very good book by someone called April Dunford called Obviously Awesome, all about positioning, that I highly recommend. And one of her things is, look, when you're first launching a product or something like this, do go broad, but as soon as you can, start tightening it up. Just thought mention that. I think don't be scared to focus that positioning. You'll be amazed how many people can see that you might be able to transfer those skills to other industries.
I was a freelancer for only a few months, so I really can't talk about positioning myself as a freelancer. But when I was working on entrepreneurial projects and now most lately dMBA, if you think about dMBA, it only still does one thing. It's just one thing, it's just a business course for designers. And that's what you're usually afraid of in the beginning. Like, oh, is it just this? But I think going deep with one topic kind of gives you the permission then to start talking about more things later down the road. But if you try to be everything in the beginning, everything to everybody, then you're just too vanilla for everybody. But if you try to be, okay, this is one thing, but then once you have that initial ball rolling, you can like venture into new stuff. It's not just fintech anymore, it's something else. And I really like this to pick up also what James said about once you have deep knowledge in certain industry, that's what a lot of clients want to pay for, because they know you worked with other companies in the same space. And even though you're under NDA, your experience is what they're paying for. Because sometimes I would love to know what companies in my industry are doing. And if there would be freelancers working with different companies in my space, you're just willing to pay more because you're getting like the answer, not something somebody just came up with through the design thinking process. Nothing against design thinking process, but if somebody has gone through 5-6 different projects, they have seen certain failures, they have seen certain tendencies in this industry, and that's just what you're paying for. So I wanted to ask you to building on this, how do you see positioning and pricing being related? Or maybe if you have any stories of how your own prices changed when you changed positioning.
It's a good question. It's a very, very good question. And I'm trying to think of which way to approach it, because it's you're not sure how much everyone else is making or charging. You're not sure how much that, if you're working through a consultancy, how much they're charging you out at, what their percentage are they want to make, whether it's 30% they want to make, whether it's 50%, or even if they're charging at 100% more than what you're charging. All you can have is a feeling of how much you're worth. And that takes some time to work out. I would say that I immediately increased my pricing when I went up by seniority. So, which I think is quite natural. I think everyone does that. So, moving from junior to mid to senior to, high-level strategist or consultant, you just immediately move your pricing up with that. And you don't know if you're charging too much until someone says, no, I'm not going to pay that. And I would recommend everyone pushing up their price probably on a yearly basis and just and using that as a marker and waiting for clients to come back and say, oh no, maybe that's too much. I've got some things that I use specifically for the UK market. There's a company called Cogs Agency, and they release a salary report every year, and it classifies it in experience. It classifies it as a day rate or a yearly package, and it's a really, really good marker for people who are struggling pricing themselves to just look at that pricing, because they do a survey across the industry, and they survey some like 2,000 different designers, so their data actually is pretty solid. And the other way that you can also do is if you talk to recruitment, it's very different it's very, very different in each country how freelancing works. In the UK, it's quite mature in terms of you've got recruitment companies who represent you, and you can just talk to them and say, how much should I be charging myself out at? I've got this month, this amount of experience, this is my portfolio. What should I be charging? And if a recruitment consultant is any good, they'll be able to tell you straight away how much you should be charging. I feel like
Can you trust
them? Well, no, of course you can't. Because they're always looking at number one, right? They're looking at how much percentage they're going to make as well, and but it's good data to have. That's the thing. You don't know how much you should be charging until really you work full time for a company and you start understanding how much they're charging you out at. Because that was the big eye opener for me. When I know that I was getting a salary of a few £100 or euros or dollars or whatever you want to call it, but a few hundred a day, and then seeing the pricing sheet of the consultancy charging me out, and your mind kind of explodes. Yeah.
Before you go, Tom, just to share one story. So when I joined the design agency, I studied business before that, so I had to learn design like while I was there, and most of my colleagues were just designers who were not interested in the business side. But there was one like sales meeting every week where we discussed about upcoming projects and so on, and I was always most interested in the price, how much are we charging for this project, and I would try to talk to the people selling the project to see how they calculate this price. And there was a spreadsheet with daily rates and stuff, and that was my most the best way to actually learn how this business works and to see how much we are being shipped off for in a way. So if there's a way to figure out this, and in most companies, usually design agencies are pretty open in terms of the culture. So if you just keep asking, if you're an internal person, then they will somehow show you this. If nothing else, at least the ranges, and that's a really good number to have, because it kind of lets you know what the top companies are charging for. We probably can't do the same, but you at least have now something to work with. How was it for you, Tom?
Yeah, I think pricing is one of those things that a lot of designers sort of squirm about, don't like talking about money and rates and things like that. So I think it's healthy we're having that discussion. I wish more designers would talk more openly about money, I think, because very often our value is understated. James mentioned a great resource there around publishing day rates. There's a sort of, I guess, matchmaking agency in the UK for freelancers, and companies called Juno that does a similar thing. And I know so many designers who have fallen off their chair when they realise how much more they could have been charging. So I think talking more about money is healthy in design. I think we often very much see it as a sort of dirty area. There's a lot of virtue kind of wrapped up in design, which I love that side of it, but very often we're uncomfortable talking about money and value. So that's one thing I would say. Talking about it more is really healthy. But then value is so subjective, so actually pricing can be really hard. And I think it actually becomes harder as you get more senior. The things that might have taken you a few days when you're a junior or mid-level, and you might have charged a day rate for that, maybe you can do that now in a day, still deliver the same value, but actually be shortchanging yourself by just working it out on an hourly or a daily billing. And that's where it starts to get really challenging, and the more senior you get of how you price yourself. And I find that a challenge too. I think the kind of holy grail is something called value pricing, which I know a lot of people would love to get to, which is where your pricing is based off the value you generate for the business. That's one that I've yet to really crack. I'm feeling more confident having the conversation, but it usually helps me to secure a good fixed rate or a better day rate by having a conversation around the value I'm generating, rather than having my fee attached to the value that I'm going to generate for an organization. So very often in value pricing, it'll be, right, say I'm going to design a great conversion funnel for you, and it might give you an uptick of, I don't know, 50K per month in revenue. I want, 20% of that or something, and you negotiate that way. It's a very hard conversation to have. People like Blair Enns and Christo done some kind of great conversations around this whole subject that I highly recommend. I recommend getting more comfortable talking about the value you generate when it comes to design, because that will help unlock probably better rates and things like that. And yeah, I kind of move between day rate and fixed rate for most of my work, and it really depends on the type of project. And to James's point around agencies in fintech, I've found that to some clients I seem really expensive, and to some I seem really affordable. So I'm working with a financial services company at the moment. And compared to what they pay like big global agencies for senior consultants, I seem like a bargain, and I'm flexible, and I come with a whole bunch of other benefits and no layers of bureaucracy and project management, which can be quite appealing. But then, a pre-seed startup looking at maybe a fixed rate that I'm putting out there or something like that, I have to work like super hard to show the value, because they might be looking at someone on Fiverr or, a more junior freelancer, because they've not seen the value that design can deliver. So, that conversation has to be different for different audiences, and in certain contexts you'll seem like a bargain, and others you'll have to work really hard to kind of express value.
What about you, James? Like, do you do day rates, fixed rates, or value-based pricing?
Value-based pricing, I absolutely love. So I love value-based pricing. If you're going direct to client, you can do it. But if you're using a recruitment consultant, say, or you're going through an agency and they're, for want of a better term, farming you out as a contractor or consultant, it's usually always going to be a day rate. So again, I tend to put in quite a high day rate, and I've now got to that point where we generally have a conversation 9 times out of 10 of, well, could you maybe do something a bit better than that? Not always. Last couple of ones have not been that, actually, but one very, very recent one was actually. But I too assigned to Blair Enns and to Christo about the value-based pricing, and Jonathan Stark as well is probably one of my favourite ones on that. And why is that? Because if you're running a package like a design sprint, which is a 1-week package, or if you put it in a package like AJ and Smart does over 4 weeks, you've got a particular start and end, and you're not being brought on as a consultant to work with the client or work through the problem over days or maybe weeks or even months or even years. And I've worked with consultants who are literally in banks, large organisation for years, and they work as a consultant and a very good rate as that. But if you're selling a specific set of services like design sprint, or you're talking about a specific outcome like Tom's talking about, then sometimes you can deliver that very quickly. It might be a day or a few days or a few weeks. And that's when you have to have that value-based pricing. So let's just talk about money. So, because I actually love talking about money now, and I love sitting down with a client and I like saying to them, okay, so this problem you've got, how valuable is it to you? First of all, how important is this project to you? Is it something you need to solve right now, or can it wait a year? And so you can start feeling their urgency, right? And this is all stuff that we've all learned from those people we talked about just now. And once you start understanding if it's really urgent, then you can know that you can start charging a bit more, because you're probably the problem to this, the solution to this urgent problem they have. And then once you know the urgency, you can then start talking about the dollars, the dollar sign. And, how much is this project worth to you? How much revenue are you going to be bringing in? I always ask that, how much revenue is going to be coming in through this if we solve this? So if it is like 50,000, like Tom mentioned, then you can start having that conversation of 20% or 5%, whatever you feel is right, you can then start pitch that. And now I run workshops, and the last workshop we ran, we charged $7,500 for an hour and a half workshop. So that's pretty good, right? As a freelancer, you wouldn't be charging $7,500 for an hour and a half of your time, or you would try, but you probably wouldn't get that. So first of all, you've got to wrap it up in such a way that the client's going to buy it. For that, you've got to show the value, the outcomes they're going to get for that. And once you've packaged it up and you're able to sell that to the client, they're going to pay for it, because you're solving a problem in these workshops that we run that doesn't guarantee, but it helps them to bring in revenue of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this is actually referring to something in NFTs, which is another business I work in as well, business area. But it's how you position it, right? It's definitely possible to charge at a fixed rate, and a very high fixed rate, if you know that you can deliver the solution that they so desperately need. And desperate in a good way, right? It's urgent for them, and you can deliver that solution.
I want to dig deeper into this 7,500 workshop for an hour. First of all,
you get 90
like, how did you know that this is, sorry, hour and a half. So how did you know that this is a good price? And then another thing that's related to the pricing that often we don't talk about is the payment terms. So once you figure out that's the price, 7,500, how did the client pay for this? Upfront? Is it 90-day delivery, or how did you negotiate this part?
Okay, so first question, how do we get to that number? So
yes,
I took it from my experience in design sprints, and selling design sprints, a weekly engagement or a full weekly engagement, doing those workshops, and learning from AJ and Smart, who are very public in how much they charge. So they are down on record. Jonathan Courtney, if you're listening to this, I love you so much. You actually said on a podcast with Jake Knapp that you charge 20,000 euros a week for design sprint, and you sell that in a 4-week package. So about 80,000 for a month's work. And that's about 3 people in there doing that and delivering that. You can start then scaling back and designing your own workshops, whether they're an hour and a half or a day or whatnot, and you can start understanding how much to charge. I've charged £1,500 for doing a value proposition workshop. The client got so much value out of that. That was completely undercharged, horribly undercharged. And the particular workshop we're talking about now, this strategy workshop, we charged that first of all at $5,000. We didn't get any pushback, zero pushback for that number. And we also, to your second question, charged in advance. We're not going to hold this session for you until you give us the money. So once we got the money wired to us in our bank account, we would then run the session. And so we increased the price to $7,500. We still don't get pushback for that number. We still deliver incredible value for the client. Once they implement this strategy, they are literally bringing in revenue of hundreds of thousands of dollars on these strategies that we help them put together. So if anything, I think we're undercharging for doing an hour-and-a-half workshop. and we give a little bit of a report after that, but generally it's the workshop, and you take away the Miro board, the virtual whiteboard with you, and the knowledge from that. And if you implement it as we've laid out, we've co-created together, it will work. It works. And we've worked with clients now where we've done these strategy workshops, and they've actually bought more. Said, wow, that was really good. We think that was really valuable. We want to book another 4 of those with you, right? And then we've run another 4 of those with you. I honestly don't think design people charge enough money for what they do. And it is possible to charge more money. You just need to walk in and be confident about the value that you're delivering. So we've delivered these workshops now in a set of 7 steps, and we've designed it. We have a beautiful deck. We run through the client what exactly we're going to deliver over these 7 workshops, these 7 steps that are around an hour each, sometimes even under 30 minutes. And they can buy them at $3,000 a pop, or they can put them in 3-in-1 for an hour and a half and buy it for $7,000. And we then sometimes stay on with that client and implement that strategy with them as well. We provide a team to actually implement that. And we're just seeing the fruition of a particular engagement like that, and it's working. And they're just saying, okay, now we trust you. Now we really do trust you, because we can see that the revenue targets, the numbers that you put in and predicted, are being hit, and we want more of that. So yeah, that's how we came to the number, just by testing the numbers with different clients, with different engagements, and kind of increasing our confidence to what we think it should be. And in fact, I think it probably should still be more. We increased it by 50% quite recently, a couple of weeks ago, and people are still saying yes. And then we generally, especially if it's a new client, we ask for payment up front.
Another cool part of this story is that you're productizing the service. You're taking something that could be sold as a service, and you're packaging it as a workshop, and that this, I think, also increases the value of what you're selling, because you can, with a product, you can kind of see, or at least have more control of what's going to happen, and at least more people can imagine what they would get out of this engagement. But I also want to hear from you, Tom, like, what are your stories with the payment terms? Any horror stories, any tips for the listeners?
I have to say, I think I've been very fortunate that I've only had one late payer, and that was just an admin issue. This is kind of quite dull compared to what we talked about, but in admin terms, when I'm working on a day rate, it tends to be I'll do like a month's work or a week's work, depending on the engagement terms, and then payment within 7 or 28 days. That's pretty standard. And like I said, I've never really had late payers. When it comes to fixed price work or retainer work, which I've done a little bit more of recently, which has been really interesting for fitting things in, a couple of held days around other work, that tends to be 50% upfront for a fixed price piece of work, and then 50% on delivery. And for retainers, it's all paid in advance. So it varies. And very often the payment terms depend on, if you're working through an agency, very often they'll have like particular payment terms. So never really had any issues working that way. When it comes to value pricing, which is something, like I say, I'm getting more confident having the conversation about value pricing. It's not something I've pulled off yet as far as my fee will be attached to a particular maybe percentage uptick in revenue. That's an interesting one for me, as far as like how you measure that, how you put trust in a client, giving you the right metrics to be paid effectively. I'm hoping to get to a point where I can test that stuff out. But yeah, I think the conversation around value pricing is an interesting one to be having, even if you're not ending up having your fee attached to that value, because you are having conversations about the revenue you will generate, or leads you will bring in, or if you're in charity, donors that you might bring into an organization. So I think it's a very prudent conversation for designers to start having. And I think that's why having more business acumen and kind of talking more about value, it separates designers at the moment. If you're just talking in terms of deliverables and usual tools and processes, that is really just table stakes at the moment. It's very hard to compare you to someone who's charging maybe a third of what you might. So I think becoming more confident in that, expressing the value that you bring, practice talking about it, I think.
Yeah, I think like in your pitching process, if you start asking about metrics and about KPIs, that in itself, just the act of asking about metrics, about business goals, tells the client that you are thinking about their success, not just about your deliverables. Because the client's biggest fear is, oh, I'm dealing with a designer who just wants to create something that's beautiful, and they don't care about if it's going to work or not. So just the mere act of asking about what is your goal, how would you measure it, they're going to be happy that you're asking about it. So it's just a matter of doing it. And I think it sets you apart. It helps you raise prices and understand what price to charge. So I think it's like a nice little hack for this process.
It all starts raising the bar for our whole industry if more of us are talking more confidently about this stuff. And I kind of wanted to mention on the subject of kind of payment as well, and having kind of a payment and having confidence, having these kind of conversations with clients and not feeling like you're going to frighten them off, is having some buffer. Like I know a lot of people who don't leave a lot of money in their businesses as contractors, and right now, like, it's a hard message to say because, you know, cost of living is what it is. But if you are in a position where you can leave a bit more money in the business, I think it just really frees you up to kind of maybe stand your ground a little more around rates, maybe stand your ground around value, and just have a more confidence knowing I don't need to take this work. Design contracting is extremely lucrative, and it's, you know, it can be hard to resist taking that capital outright, but I would just highly recommend people have enough capital in there that they can take a few risks, play around with these kind of conversations. It frees you up enormously. But yeah, just something that I feel is quite an important aspect of running a successful design consultancy, is having that cushion.
Cool. Did you forget anything? I think buffer is a big part of it. Positioning, pricing, terms. Is there anything that you, James, or Tom wanted to add to this topic before we close it?
I think there's other things we could have touched on. You know, the whole part equity piece. Sorry, James.
No, I think the equity one is actually a very, very good point. That is something we should talk about. And I just, when you're saying, Tom, that contracting is extremely lucrative, it is extremely lucrative. But you're also getting paid by day. Look, 99% of the time, contractors are on a day rate. They're getting paid day by day by day by day. And what I would really love to see, probably quite selfishly from my experience of, you know, doing those workshops and selling things at a fixed cost profitably, is how do we move from being a contractor and doing a day rate to being a contractor and selling at fixed price and selling at a fixed outcome with a fixed rate. Because I don't really see many designers, I don't see the industry just generally doesn't work like that. They generally see it's a bum on a seat. They're going to be producing this stuff for me today, and I'm probably going to need to buy 100 days of that person. So that's one thing that came to my mind. But I think the equity piece, if we want to speak about that as well, is a really interesting thing, right? Someone promising you 3% of equity in exchange for your services is quite frightening and also quite tempting as well, especially if you know that you can deliver upon that. But there's a lot of other wheels turning that you don't necessarily have power over. So if there's other things, outside forces affecting your deliverables, even though that you keep your side of the bargain and you put in a great strategy, but they're going to pull in the team to execute that strategy, but they don't execute it well, then you can miss out on that equity as such, because you didn't have control over the execution team. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, the equity side of things.
I think it's very much ends up being a hedge, doesn't it, for designers who are comfortable doing it. I think you'd go into it knowing that the chances of me getting a return on this way of being paid. So maybe it's worth us taking a few steps back for listeners who maybe aren't familiar. But this is typically in early stage organizations, maybe pre-seed, seed stage startups where they maybe don't have a lot of funding, but would really benefit from senior design input, maybe can't stomach your day rate or your fixed price at the moment. And therefore there might be a negotiation path of, okay, we will give you some level of equity, a share of the business, in exchange for your design efforts. And sometimes that is part equity, part rate, or it's all equity, or sweat equity is very often how this is referred to. And yeah, to your point, James, there's an enormous amount of trust you need to put in that organization that they're going to deliver and that you might get a return on that. So let's say you said, okay, I'm not going to take any rate, but I want, 5% of the business for, several months of effort. I'm there. You might never see a return on that. And I think, you would need to do your due diligence and maybe do some paid work first with that organization to see, okay, do they seem like they've got product market fit, or I can help them get there? They're receptive to design. They're starting to get interest from investors like they said they would. And then, okay, maybe you want a longer term relationship. I'm interested. And, if that startup really went somewhere, and let's say I IPO'd one day, 10 years down the line, you could really do well out of that. That could be some retirement money. But in most instances, we know startups fail. So, again, to my point around having some money in the bank, I think, again, it frees you up to say, okay, I don't need the capital on this one. I can start playing around with these other models of getting paid. So I think it's a really interesting one. But to your point, James, I think you need to have a good sense of what makes a good business and a good startup. And again, learning about business, right? Understanding what the mechanics of an early stage organization, what's going to help them succeed, and also us as designers having that mindset to help them. And when you've got skin in the game, you're going to want them to succeed as well.
Additional perspective here is how investors think about investing in startups. So typically they look at, okay, we need to make 20 bets or 10 bets for one of them to work out. And if one of them works out, it pays off for everything else. So I would be thinking about this equity the same way. Like, okay, then if I try this out, how can I de-risk somehow? Either I need to do 20 of these so I can even have a chance that it works out, or I maybe need to do a hybrid. I take a little bit of equity, but still need to cover the expenses. Maybe you won't be as profitable with this project. You just cover the expenses and then you take some equity on top. So you don't go all in. So because this like equity pricing is it's very close to the topic of risk. How do you run risk for your own organization as a contractor? Maybe you have one client at a time who is just equity, but the rest is paying your bills, or you have so much money in the bank that you can actually for a year just go out and just do 10 projects, and that's your startup year in a way. So there are different approaches to it, but the name of the game is like managing the risk and having enough bets that one of them can even pay off. Because if you just do one, it's a lottery. But if you try to do more, I think then numbers and the math and the stats start to be on your side.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think that I had this conversation recently. I worked with a pre-stage company for a while and was kind of interested in if we wanted to work longer term, would there be the conversation of equity? And very often they want you to come in perm to take on that. Very often there's what's known as like an options pool of shares in a company that they will give to like trusted advisors that they've had a long-term relationship with, on non-exec directors, things like that. So very often it's kind of baked into the share model of a startup. So it's a familiar thing, but I think you really, really have to show enormous value as someone who wants to continue being an external person rather than coming in-house. But no, I do think it's interesting.
Because we have to be aware that equity is the most expensive way to get funded. Why most expensive? Because if you go to the bank, you pay off 5-10% interest rate. In these days, 2% interest rate, but it used to be more. And then, you keep the company. But if you're giving up the equity, this is potentially for a startup their biggest equity. Equity is their biggest equity. So from the perspective of the founder, you need to really bring something extraordinary that they cannot buy with money. Otherwise, they would rather just pay somebody. It needs to be something they cannot buy, because that's the way their founders are thinking even about their co-founders is, can I buy this on the market? If the answer is yes, they don't need you as a co-founder. They can just have you as an employee. So a big part of this story is also getting to know the mindset of these people, like the founders, and how they're thinking about it, and why would I even do this deal with you? So like the first step would be learning about math and stats and learning about this world of the startups, or like reading some books on the angel investing. That's probably what it is. It's like you are being an angel investor with your time.
Absolutely.
Cool. I think this whole topic like warrants a separate episode, equity, pricing. And we should maybe do that at some point. It is.
Yeah. No, it is.
I can see you both thinking
about it. I do think it's potentially one where so many designers are missing out. There's so many like developers and people like that who end up, kind of being early stage, kind of founding members of startups. But yeah, designers, it's still a bit of a rarity. And there's good people out there doing like trying to change that message, and yeah. I don't know if this is relevant to the podcast or not, but something that I came across recently that I thought was quite interesting from pricing and positioning. Friend of mine who used to work with an agency, he's been freelance for a little while now. He has actually set himself up with a subscription model for his design practice, which is really interesting. And it's expensive, several £1,000s every month. But he's making some promises around delivery and quality that I think is fascinating. And I haven't spoken to him about it yet, so I don't want to kind of mention him or kind of infer too much about it. But I have never really seen someone position themselves in that way. And he's very much talking about what good value he will be compared to a big agency or an internal employee, the flexibility that's involved in it. And he's a shit-hot designer as well. I've no doubt he could be able to turn around quite a lot of clients. So yeah, I need to talk to him about that. And I think you might want to talk to him about that at some point.
Then you'll need to give me his name, but let's talk about it later. One question about this. So how is this subscription different from a retainer?
To be honest, I don't know enough about it. At the moment, to tell you more about it. I guess you could view it as a sort of retainer. I don't think he's retainers tend to be like set number of days that you're retaining for the client. I don't think he's committing to that. I think he's just saying you'll get good stuff delivered. It might take him a day, it might take him a week, and he's kind of factoring that risk into his pricing model.
Got it.
He's very, very good, very fast.
That helps.
So yeah, I think he could be on something there if that's the kind of work you want to do. He does a lot of stuff in space. I think you probably are both more confident in than me in sort of Web3 paid space as well.
Yeah,
so
I might them, especially in Web3.
He's a really interesting guy.
Would love to take you up on that. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, James. That was a lovely hour chatting about money, chatting about positioning, something our community needs to do more of. So I'll think about doing one more just on equity, and I'll ping you both. But yeah, that's everything in today's episode. If you found this interesting and want to learn more about business, check out the mini MBA, which is the 7-day email course, which you can find at d.MBA/mini-MBA. That's all. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye.